Okay, and now for our wrap-up panel for the day. I hope everybody's been enjoying the presentations. I know I have, and I'm going to just briefly introduce our last two panelists, who, as I mentioned, are in charge of integration and big picture thinking and profundity. No, I mean they will do whatever they want, basically. And first up is Liz Plater-Zyberk, who is a partner with Andres Duany in Duany, Plater-Zyberk and Company, a big architecture firm in Miami. Liz was dean at the University of Miami School of Architecture for 18 years. She didn't hold out for 20. But Liz is just also a founder of CNU, Congress for the New Urbanism, and well-known author and reigning authority on all things new urbanism. And it's so hard to briefly identify her accomplishments because they are so many. So I'll turn it over to Liz, and then we'll hear from Scott, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon. This was an incredible opportunity to hear you all giving presentations from so many different disciplines and so many different points of view on a topic that's been important in my life for a long time. I think the only thing I heard from last night to today that might be somewhat regrettable is the statement that the neighborhood does not exist. But I think in general, we've been seeing quite a positive approach to the research on it. Yes, Emily asked me to be integrative and to try to pull together some comments about what I would hear during the course of the day. And I must say, in advance, I knew that would be impossible because it always takes a long time for things to percolate, and then the next morning I wake up and I say, I should have said this and I should have said that. So I prepared a different kind of integration, which is to give you some very basics about what we as designers, the synthesizers, do potentially with what you analyze in the academy, and how we use it, because it's incredibly important, especially in political life today, where community and neighborhood often plays out, and if you can point to the science, it can be very effective. So I'll start out by saying that my engagement with the concept of neighborhood began as a child, growing up next door to friends with a grocery store down the street and walking to the bus and the train, and so that probably has influenced me a lot. We are approaching the 30th year of a revival of intentional neighborhood design and building, and the prospects of American society continuing to value, create, and rebuild neighborhoods looks good. I would like to speak about this movement from the perspective of the new urbanism, including what has been or still has to be overcome to achieve goals of neighborhood making. I'm presuming that Scott will introduce additional concepts of performance and measurement, while I focus on design and the observations of behavior, with an emphasis on observation rather than actual data or analysis, but certainly designers, after looking back at our recent history in the 20th century, seek ways of understanding what works and what doesn't in order to not repeat mistakes that at least we've seen. And of course, we don't have the time. We can't spend 6 or any number of years testing what we do. We're working in a completely different realm of often high-speed decisions that with high stakes, and there is the test when it's done. And in fact, nobody pays us to go back and do, I've even forgotten what they're called, the kind of in situ, post-occupancy when we were in school, they were still doing post-occupancy research, but that no longer gets done. So we need your pre-occupancy research. I do think that we've seen that, and we're calling on the growing evidence of the benefits to the individual of connectedness and interdependence in communities of place. Neighborhoods are communities of place. And I might also make reference to research that's going on at the University of Miami, which emanated from the Department of Psychiatry when they came to the School of Architecture and said, individuals have a relationship to community the way buildings have relationships to cities. There must be some connection. And some of you know my colleagues who've done the research on well-being of children and elders in relation to their place of residence, for instance. In our thinking, the neighborhood is the vessel for community of place. For others, this is still undesirable or an outdated concept, but tech advances do not necessarily acknowledge the relationship between the built environment and human behavior in daily activities. The modern emphasis on autonomy and separation are reflected in contemporary auto-dependent mobility. I think we've talked about that in the course of this day. And the built environment's monoculture separating us by race, wealth, and age. These are realities, and in some sense, how we manage them becomes important. It should be noted that in the US, it's possible to avoid community. One can choose to live apart, as many do, and the efforts of new urban community builders are not coercive. We're generally directed to increasing choice, encouraging neighborhood structure in reaction to many decades of preclusion by regulations and financial instruments. That's to say that suburbia was not a market result only. So a group of slides before I come back to a conclusion. This slide is about a series of organizations, several of which began at the same time in the 90s. All, I would say, sharing values. One of you mentioned about the values of community. So this in fact reflects a big neighborhood of people sharing values about community building. Smart Growth America, the CNU, the Form-Based Code Institute, the Green Building Council, the Institute for Classical Architecture, you might not think should be there, but they're playing a role in it, and of course, the National Charrette Institute, which helps train people about how to work on the built environment together. And so this is here as a reference if you ever want to know more about any of them. We are certainly, I think, all pulling in the same direction. These, Smart Growth America, and everybody has their kind of manifesto. I would say largely some of it based on research and analysis, some of it on observation. But here we go, create walkable neighborhoods. That's part of Smart Growth's 10 principles. The Charter for the New Urbanism is written, you're not intended to read this, in 27 principles in 3 categories. The first one is the region, the second one is the neighborhood, district, and corridor, and the third one is street, block, and building. So it speaks to a continuum of scale, and the neighborhood is just part of that. Part of the discussion was about what about the metropolis? What about the bigger picture? Well, we're very much aware that that has enormous influences on neighborhoods. This is a slide that I frequently show. It's appropriate, especially here, because we spent quite a bit of time talking about Detroit. Those drawings on the left were done in a charrette with Doug Kelbaugh at the University of Michigan one winter. But those 2 topics, urban disinvestment and suburban sprawl, a related phenomenon, which is how the Charter for the New Urbanism starts out, pointing out that these are very much causal. Detroit's population it's already been mentioned, as a whole, as a metropolitan area, in general did not shrink. It's just the location of the residents changed. That map, those two maps are the exact same spot, one in 1950 and one more recently. And so we have looked back to history, to both ideas and successful places. The history of ideas, of course, dates back to the Garden City as a kind of structure for the metropolitan region, both environment and urbanism. Benton Mackay's ideas about conserving open space. For him, it was levees of green to stem the flood of metropolitan growth. And of course, back in the 20s, nobody did very much about this, but now we're spending expensive public dollars to buy open space. And in other places, there was a concern about making cities beautiful. In my world, in the world of architects, Adolf Loos wrote a book about the city as a work of art. Camilo Cite was known for pointing out that places could be intentionally made to be picturesque and pleasing as well as functional. So I know it's 1929 for that drawing on the left, but I was attempting to show the decades in which these ideas came forward. And from that first Clarence Perry diagram of the neighborhood to our own recreation of an understanding of the difference between traditional urbanism and the suburb, I would point out that middle diagram was made without any knowledge of the first one because nobody ever taught us that in school. We had to discover it later. And then finally making comparisons in a series of diagrams for both teaching students, clients, ourselves in the new urbanism on the right, the comparison between suburban and traditional neighborhood design. That middle part of the charter is neighborhoods, districts, and corridors. That titles and attempts to explain a larger picture. Neighborhoods are not the only increments of city building that there are. There are also single-use districts and the corridors that tie and separate all of these places. And so these are the kind of idealistic drawings that present a picture, a hoped-for picture, or a kind of framework around which to work realistically with an understanding that there's tailoring and existing conditions that play a role. And so there are one can point to five very basic principles of good neighborhood design, as we've said, and I'll run through them very quickly. We've talked about centers and edges, promoting community identity and regional access to transportation and green infrastructure. That's Forest Hills, a famous progressive era new town on the left, and a New England village. The quarter-mile radius, the 5-minute walk from center to edge that expands for potentially for transit, encourages walking and the casual interactions which foster the bonds of community. Purposefully, there are two older ladies in the slide on the right because this becomes very important to the very young and to the elder. Mix of uses, finely grained, uses and housing types in close proximity, allowing maximum interaction across incomes and ages, including aging in place. There's a lot to say here. You can mix use in buildings. Sometimes that's hard for reasons of finance. That's Woodstock on the right. Or as in Georgetown, where you might have a corner store, apartments, townhouses, and large houses within close proximity. And this is something that the new urbanists have been successful in overcoming the taboos about that kind of proximity, which we've otherwise had for over 50 years. A network of interconnected streets and small blocks which balance pedestrian and vehicular use, providing choice and mobility, reducing vehicular dependence, supporting transit, and also the kind of mobility in which people get to know each other within their neighborhood. The quarter-mile average block perimeter is something that now is guiding codes, the LEED ND standards, and so on, which is what, and in fact, there's something called space syntax, which is one of the research areas which has pointed to the benefits of small blocks for commercial uses. And finally, the fifth point, focal locations for public buildings and spaces such as schools, churches, and meeting halls, which celebrate community activities and bring people together. The American Post Office was often that kind of place. As you see here in Princeton, New Jersey, it's becoming less and less important, and maybe one of the things we could talk about is what might replace those places. So one of the first new communities that embodied these principles even before they were articulated or recorded was Seaside. I think probably many people have heard about this, and if you haven't, you can ask me about it later. It produced a form-based code, the one on the left, which later produced the traditional neighborhood district development code, which was intended to be a graft onto zoning codes, which don't allow or didn't allow traditional building in order to enable traditional neighborhood design and construction. And that moved on to the smart code, which Andres talked about. Here I should point out that as designers, we discovered that policy was an important aspect, or impediment sometimes, to what we were trying to do and how we were trying to put our observations into play as designers. And so we became involved in writing codes because that regulatory framework is so important. That discussion with the environmentalists that Andres started the morning with produced this idea of the transect, which is a continuity from the human environment, from the natural environment to the human environment. These ideas have been applied across the charter scales, at the regional scale, or at the most rural part of the transect. There are village designs which are bringing together the new agriculture, the new interest in agriculture with living in ways that I think we find very hopeful, especially in this day and age of people still leaving agricultural communities to move to cities. There may be a future to be able to once again inhabit agriculture. Kentlands in Gaithersburg, Maryland, which Andres mentioned is about to have its 25th anniversary, broke through a lot of the taboos of real estate development and community making in the 80s, including the mixing of different sizes and price points of housing close together. In these slides, when these buildings were being sold in the 80s, the range was from 120,000 to $500,000. Unheard of. It was the sort of thing that it gave bankers heartburn. The school, which was turned inward and given a front door, it was going to face the highway and just have an entry for the bus, has enabled the community to both have teachers and children walking to school. If you, as we have in one study, ask an audience like this, how many people walk to school as children, the older people in the room would say they did, but the younger people in the room probably would say they didn't. So this is already a big change. And the kind of live-work, that traditional old idea that you might have a shop or an office below residence or shops below offices was once again revived as a building type in Kentlands. All of this has influenced urban rebuilding. The Cleveland Central neighborhood, this is a late 90s project. You can see in the photo on the left how we've reformed the block structure, which was very large blocks, the kind of speculative housing in industrial cities that was, the workers' housing that was built often had a bad neighborhood structure. It really wasn't well structured, and so this is about restructuring it. This influenced Hope 6, that HUD program, which attempted to follow through on one of the policy proposals we heard this morning about dispersing poverty by mixed income communities. In the suburbs, the work has been going on in reforming the suburbs so that large single-tract ownership like this shopping center in Massachusetts become the town center for the suburban housing around them. This was a 1960s shopping center, which now has a movie theater, streets with shops below, apartments above, leading the way for suburban retrofit. A larger project in Miami for a shopping center, a very large mall, which was not a gray field, it was not yet a dead mall, was initiated by a chamber of commerce, lots of people engaged. The idea of making this into a town center, something more than the shopping center. This may be the thing that is the newest about the new urbanism, which is in fact the public participation in the built environment. It's a participation that's been demanded through NIMBYism, protests, preservation, people showing up at public hearings and so on. And one of the things that has been happening and that the National Charette Institute, for instance, works on is trying to bring to a new reality the kind of political engagement of people in not only in their neighborhoods, but beyond the neighborhood to the betterment of a larger community or municipality. And so this was a group of neighbors who were sold on the idea that if they enabled densification of that shopping center, they might prevent encroachment into their residential areas, and this is what it's beginning to look like today. So the goal of neighborhood design is to make safe and satisfying places to grow up and grow old. From a broader perspective, neighborhood stewardship, reinforcing individual attachment to community, can change the disposable city syndrome which has characterized urban development in 20th century America. With an ever better understanding of the structure of community, thanks to research often, existing places can teach us about making communities better, sustainable, places where people want to live and work and which people want to maintain and preserve. This alone could be a deceptively simple impetus for forming bonds of community in a time of increasing diversity. If you are among a group of people, even if you are a newcomer, read immigrant, who share a place that is beautiful, has anyone used the word beauty yet in the last day? And if you share the desire to preserve its character and social value, you pretty much will have to get to know each other. Protecting and enhancing place can be a powerful, constructive, and unifying force for a community. Yes, that produces NIMBYs, but it can also produce a metropolitan force for improvement. If there is some larger aspect of your city or metropolis which is threatening your neighborhood, you might get involved in that bigger picture. We are dealing with that right now in South Florida with sea level rise. This brings up interesting prospects about change, evolution, what Andres called the climax condition, that there may be some places that you don't want to change, that you want to protect from change, and other places where you want to foster change. And so when we get involved in the larger plans, we always talk about that every plan is a plan of conservation and development. So one final comment for maybe my fellow presenters in this last day. When Dr. Jose Shaposnik approached the School of Architecture to talk about the potential of a research partnership, we spoke about the effectiveness of the research on the public cost of smoking as a potential model for doing research on neighborhoods and communities. That we could develop information that could be equally powerful for a group of people, the new urbanists who have gathered to share knowledge and experience, and willingness to share beyond our individual, the individual work we do. We have thus far, avoided the observed destructors of communities and neighborhoods. We would look forward to using your research in design, policy, and management proposals that we make to make neighborhoods and cities better places. And I should add that it's design and it's policy, and we do get involved in management. So if you told us, for instance, or if there was research, for instance, on what is it that every age group needs to occupy, in particular from younger to older adolescents, within a community, we could guess at it, I suppose. Is it the community garden? Is it the skateboard park? Is it a community center? Those kinds of suggestions would be immediately incorporated. Thank you.